Today we're going to take a look at this book, Connecting Chords with Linear Harmony. Connecting is the key word here that I want to focus on. So I'm going to look at all the things you are and chord tones. I have made a video in the past called how to play chord tones over autumn leaves or something like that. And this is going to be a little bit of a remake of that same video, only I'm going to add what I think is a little bit the missing piece of that puzzle, which is how we connect the chords, the arpeggios, the chord tones, to create lines, to make music basically. Let's say you want to learn how to improvise over all the things you are, and the teacher tells you, play chord tones. Yes, but how do you do that? You have to kind of make it come alive and become music. So hopefully I will show you how to do that, but I need to take things from the beginning. So we're going to review the chord tone stuff. So some of you might have already seen this. I'm going to try to talk as little as possible. I've already talked a lot, and this is going to be a long video, I'm afraid. So sorry about that, but let's get right into it. So let's look at the first 8 bars of All the Things You Are. F minor. A flat, D flat major, okay, so that's just playing the arpeggios or the chord tones. Very basic. Might be too basic for some of you. So why are we doing this? It's not that we're gonna play like this, right? It's so that we know where the notes are and what the notes are. We need to know what the notes are and how they are moving right through this tune. So that's why we're doing this. If you're a piano player, that might be super easy, thinking like, what's the point? I'm just playing the chords. But for us, it's a little bit different because there's many different ways you can play the same 4 notes. I don't want to get stuck in those details, so I'm going to move on right here. So if you think that, wow, this is way too easy, you might want to look at this as, or you should look at this as more of an ear training, and it's more ear training and knowing where the notes are, right? So if you can sing it, sorry, I can't sing, right? But I can hit the notes. It does not sound good. It's a good idea to sing the note names too, right? F, A flat, C, E flat, B flat, E, D flat, F, A flat, E flat, G, B flat, D flat. Okay. A good exercise, if you still think this is too easy, sing the whole tune with no, just give yourself a reference note, and then do this over the whole tune and see if you're still in the right pitch at the last chord, right? You also want to focus in on the difficult part. So the D flat major 7 going to the G7. Do, 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 do. Because that's where the key changes. When you're playing the D flat major 7, you should be able to hear and kind of feel the next chord, the G7. I had a teacher who was very adamant about that you need to be able to imagine the next chord, right? So this kind of exercise will help you to do that. So it's more of an ear training and kind of overall understanding of the harmony exercise than it's not a improv exercise, really. Then, of course, you should try to vary the arpeggios so that you're not just playing, just do the opposite. Right, it's a little bit harder to do because it's very easy to think of the root of the next chord, but it's not as easy to think of necessarily of the other chord tones, but it should be. So these 4 notes, there are a lot of permutations you could come up with. So some people might try to figure out all of them and practice it. I think that's a little bit, well, that could be a good exercise, but it's easy to get stuck in details where you're just kind of going through the motions. It's not important to do all the permutations, but maybe come up with 1 or 2 permutations that you like. For example, this one. So I'm starting on the 3rd, root, 5th, 7th. You might come up with some cool lines. That's pretty cool. From doing this, right? Again, more of an ear training thing. Try to sing it. Practice away from your instrument. Like, try to visualize this. Like classical players do that. They visualize the piece they're gonna play. Mental training. Another thing you can do with this kind of exercise is to get away from, it's easy to get kind of stuck in a box. So I'm thinking of this as like some kind of shape. Just move the shape. Which is, it could be helpful, it's not necessarily bad, but you might want to try to play it like on 1 string. That's a lot harder, right? So then I might have to skip octaves. See if I can do that in time. That's pretty hard to do, and it's a completely different way of practicing. And you're not thinking, you get away from the guitarisms, the guitar problem of the getting stuck in a box, and you're just thinking the notes of the chord, right? So it's a really good exercise to do, actually. So I'm just looking at the first 8 bars for, I don't want the video to go on forever, but I have this whole thing written out over the whole tune, over the whole set of changes, and it's PDFs, and you can find that on my Patreon page if you're a patron. Okay, so what am I doing here? I'm just playing 2 octave arpeggios and connecting them. So when I run out of 8 notes in that bar, I just voice lead to the next chord and play descending. And I have this whole exercise written out as a PDF, again, on my Patreon page. So this would be the next step. And I mentioned this in my Autumn Leaves video too, that I had to do this when I was at MI over Autumn Leaves, which is similar in a way. So this would be better in the sense that we're actually voice leading, which is what we're aiming for. So we're on the right track. Sorry. But this is still not very useful when we're actually playing. So I'm not saying you shouldn't practice like this. This is a very good way to practice. It's almost like an etude, right? So it's good for technique and all that. But it's not, it doesn't help much when I remember being frustrated about this, because you might practice this until you can play it really fast and really well. But still, when you go to the jam or the gig and like, let's play All the Things You Are, even if you can play it really fast, it doesn't help that much because you don't play like this. There was actually a student at Musicians Institute when I was there. He thought that, oh, if I do this, I'll learn how to play jazz. So he just practiced arpeggios like that over every standard. Like he practiced like hours on end every day. So he could really, really do that. And then he was playing with one of Scott Henderson's open counselings. And he was just playing arpeggios. And Scott was like, what are you doing? Well, I'm improvising. I'm playing a solo. No, you're just practicing, right? So, but still, it's still a valid, good technique exercise. And you have to think about how you're going to position these arpeggios and how to pick them. And it's a good for technique exercise, right? So the problem with this is that it's hard to do. This is not how you play music. So then I had a teacher later on who said, well, what you need to do is you need to don't just play the arpeggios in order like that, because you have to separate the idea of arpeggios. This might be an arpeggio, right? Like C major 7 arpeggio. But if you're playing chord tones, you don't have to play them in order. This is C major 7 chord tones. Like I'm over exaggerating a bit, but right? So imagine you're playing like that, but every time we go from a chord to the next chord, you want to find the smoothest voice leading. So a half step or a whole step or the same note. You're always a half step or a whole step away from or a same note away from any note of the next 4-part chord. There isn't any 4-part chord that could go to any other 4-part chord where you can't find a voice leading like that. If you can prove me wrong, do that, but I think I'm right there. There's always going to be a half step away or a whole step away or the same note. So if I do that over All Things You Are, so I play F minor, but randomly. Sorry. Let's say that's my last note, the E flat. Next chord is B flat. I could go to F or I could go to D flat. But I need to make that transition, because when we're playing over changes, we're actually playing over the changes. If I do this, like we did in the beginning, I'm not playing the changes. I'm playing this chord, next chord, and the next chord. It would be better to play a phrase over the bar line, which is where this is where we were heading, okay? So in order to do this, you have to slow things down quite drastically, I think, unless you're a genius. So I'm gonna make a really slow backing track. It shouldn't be rubato, because then you don't really know where the chord is changing, but super slow. By the way, when you make these backing tracks for yourself, I'm using a loop pedal. Don't play extensions and stuff, because that's confusing for the ear when you're trying to just play the 4-part chords. Okay, so I'm gonna try to connect. a really good exercise. I used to do this a lot, I remember. Because you break away from the finger shapes and the positions and use the whole fretboard, right? Just jump around. So now we're improvising. That's the good news. The bad news is that this is really, really hard to do, especially at a faster tempo. It's almost impossible. I see people talk about this. For example, Mike Stern. I've seen it a couple of times workshops, both in reality and videos where he does this over autumn leaves. I'll see if I can find a video and link to it. He makes it sound really good. Just on a side note, I noticed that every time he does that or somebody shows this exercise in a clinic, they do it for a while and then he can't help himself. Mike Stern can't help himself, so he starts playing all this other stuff after a while. And that sounds really good and people are like, then he says, oh, I deviated from the arpeggios or the chord tones. Sorry about that. And everybody's in the audience is thinking, well, that's the stuff we want. What were you doing there? But he's like, don't play chord tones and don't play that other shit. But it's like, we want that other shit. It's just something I noticed. One way you can get started with this, is if this is very hard for you, is to do the idea of skipping a string, like removing a string, imagining you remove a string. So if I remove the G string, okay, so you could actually do that, remove a string. Let's say you're gonna change strings. Just remove a string or two and try to do this exercise and see what happens. I've heard that Jim Hall used to do this. I don't know if that's true, but that's what I've heard. Maybe you know this. Comment below. You might notice that I still haven't gotten to the book, so there's even more stuff to cover before. The book is what's gonna connect it all or tie it all together, so just bear with me, okay? One more thing before I get to what it is that the book is introducing that we're missing is that there are other ways you could play arpeggios. You could do extended arpeggios. So let's say I have a 2-5-1 in C major. It sounds pretty lame, right? So it might be a good idea to think of extend arpeggio to the 9th. Then you can start on the 3rd and remove the roots. That gives you the extensions. That's what's called extended. It's not extended arpeggios, it's a superimposed arpeggios. I have made a video on superimposed arpeggios. Another thing you could do is the very common thing is the F major 7. You could just let the C drop to B and play an F major 7 flat 5. It's called the piano voicings. Sounds like this. So if I do that over the first 8 bars of All the Things You Are, it sounds like this. Or the piano voicings. Sorry about that little mistake in the loop. So that sounds better. So you might want to spend some time thinking about which arpeggios you like, so that, because for me, for example, the dominant 7 arpeggio, I don't like how that sounds. It sounds lame for some reason. So you might want to decide to use different arpeggios that you prefer over different chords. That's how you develop your own style, right? And obviously over the dominant chords, there are so many different options of different arpeggios you could use over dominant chords. I don't really have time to get into all that here because the video would be ridiculous. It's already pretty long. So that's just another little thing you can add into this whole mix. Okay, now we're finally gonna get to what's to this book. Because let's say we've done all this that I've covered up until this point in the video. There's still something that I think that teacher that told me to do that exercise missed. And that is when he said connect to the closest note. There are some notes that you should focus on more. Some of the notes are more important in a way, namely the guide tones. And some of you are sick of hearing me talk about the guide tones all the time. I talk about the guide tones all the time because that's a really important ingredient in all this. So if you can think about the guide tones, so the 3rd and the 7th. Those notes are obviously what kind of guides us through the harmony. They kind of shape the harmonic movement of the tune. If I can create a guide tone line, focusing on that, these are the notes. You could let the B drop to an A just to keep that movement. If I can connect those notes, so again, I'm not thinking about the guide tone and another guide tone. I'm thinking about the transition, the E flat to the D flat. So chord tones, but I want to use those notes as my transition point. You don't have to do it all the time, obviously, but it's a really good way to, it's a good idea to focus on those, to practice that way. Now it's starting to sound a little bit more like something that makes sense. So how you do this? Well, this is where this book comes in. You can use what Bert Ligon calls harmonic outlines. And I've also made a video about harmonic outlines. It's actually a concept that he introduces in another book by him, Jazz Theory Resources, Volume 1. There's one chapter called General Harmonic Outlines. I think it's what it's called. And this book is just like an extension of that chapter. So this is a whole book based off that idea. And there are 3 harmonic outlines. They could be based on scales or arpeggios. So one of them, I think it's number 3, is this one. So I'm playing the arpeggio and I'm connecting those 2 notes. That's a harmonic outline. We could start on the other chord, the second chord. because we're playing chord tones. There was nothing there. I was playing chord tones, but it sounds good. It sounds like jazz because it's one of those things. It's an idiomatic jazz phrase, you know. It's around midnight, right? So we hear that phrase all the time. So that's why you also want to be a little bit careful. But what you can do now, some are thinking, well, that's it. I want you to think of that as a kind of the template which you're going to build your solo or your improvisation around. So that's the default setting or the foundation of your solo. So imagine now, just look at the difference between what we had before. There's no space there, there's no room for adding stuff. But this, you can hear the tune, right? Now also I can start to add things. Let's try the whole tune. So I'm using that as kind of something that I'm creating a solo. Obviously it sounds pretty cliche and pretty dumb, to be honest, but I can add all this stuff. I can throw in little chord stabs. I can add chromaticism. And obviously I'm changing everything rhythmically. It enables me to be more rhythmically free. So in this book, there is just, he calls this outline 3, I think it is. There's just a whole bunch of examples of variations and how you can add passing notes, how you can change the rhythm. You can skip octaves. I forgot to mention that. So could be instead of there's all sorts of things you can do. So it will say, like, for example, Bill Evans, Sonny Rollins, and then give you examples of different ways. So basically a bunch of licks based off of these general harmonic or harmonic outlines. So you could take any of those and just apply it to a tune like this and build up an arsenal of licks, and you'll notice, like, oh, I see you can do that and you can do this. And then at the end there's like, he'll take a bunch of standards like All the Things You Are, and he will just write out the harmonic outlines so that you can add all this stuff yourself once you learn how to create those little embellishments and stuff. So a very simple example would be, for example, to do this. There was a little technique. So instead of going, you drop the D an octave. I think Barry Harris calls this pivot. And all of a sudden it sounds like Charlie Parker. So Charlie Parker would play that kind of thing, right? So that's an example of how you can use ornamentation on this outline, right? So the book is filled with examples like that. Another thing you have to think about is how you can rhythmically vary these. You don't want to play it, you know, so for example, you could do this. If we're back to C major 7, I could do this instead. Right? Or so there are obviously many ways you could, variations you could come up with, and the book also has a whole list of that. But you could figure it out yourself. So that's taking a phrase and anticipating it and moving it. It's the kind of stuff that jazz players do. It's part of the jazz, you know, the jazz thing. If you have a tune like, you know, Fly Me to the Moon, the real book might say to play it like that. But obviously, I can't remember how it's notated exactly, but obviously as a jazz player, you know how to you're expected to kind of come up with your own rhythmic interpretation of the melody on the spot. It's just simpler, easier to read it and to look at the sheet of music if it's written more strict, and then you add your own rhythm to it. Unless you're writing for an ensemble where several people are going to play the melody at the same time, then you have to write it out exactly as you want it. So for you looking at big band charts, for example. So there's some of the tunes that he's using those 3 outlines over, even giant steps. Then there's a bunch of examples like etudes at the end and a transcription of a Lou Donaldson solo where there's a lot of these outlines. He's using them. He's probably not thinking about it, right? It just happens to work that way. And the only thing I don't like about this book is that he will say Cannonball Adderley plays this one and Clifford Brown plays another one, and he explains the ornamentation and all that. But it doesn't say from which solo and with what recording. It would be nice to just, you know, look it up and listen to it. But that's just a minor little criticism I have. Now, so if you're thinking that, yeah, this is good, but I just don't want to sound too cliche, then try to figure out how you can play these outlines to make it more yours. You could come up with your own way of playing, because it's going to sound pretty cliche, obviously, if you play a lot of these. Now, also, you might think, well, this whole thing puts me in the wrong headspace because it's my analytical side of my brain that's working. And I think you should, sometimes when you practice, you need to be in that headspace. But one thing you could do is you could decide, I'm going to work on this for the A section and the C section, but let's say the 2 5s to G major and the 2 5s to E major. Is it the C section or is the B section? I'm not sure. You could leave those open and just don't do this there. Do something completely different. So I'll show you what I mean. Now I'm going to use this harmonic outlines for the first sections, and I'm going to play something, just go for it all over that other section. So there, I was combining two different approaches over the same tune, just to keep the practice session a little bit more interesting for myself, right? So now, of course, some of you are maybe thinking, "Oh, cool! I'm gonna do all of this, and I'm all the what we just covered, right? I'm gonna practice my arpeggios like that, and now I'm gonna be able to play jazz." So this is just one way you could approach learning how to solo over all the things you are. Some people might never do this and still sound great. There are many ways you could practice playing the changes over all the things you are. You could play bob scales. You could do more of a Barry Harris approach. You could play licks. Learn enough licks and you will learn how to play, or transcribe 10 solos over the course of a year, and you will probably know how to play over all the things you are. Then there's all this other stuff you could do, like pentatonics, hexatonics, and all these concepts, right? There's so many different approaches. What is it? Is it a Lee Konitz idea where you take the melody and then you just deviate, or you add stuff to the melody so that it's less and less sounds like the melody? It's kind of the same idea, that you add ornamentation, and the more you add, the less it's going to sound like the actual melody, right? So there's a lot of work to do, and ultimately the goal is to be able to play like intuitively. So you hear something, you imagine something, your ears know where to go and your fingers know where to go. There are many different ways you can get to that destination. This is just one way, and I think for me this has been very helpful and necessary in my development, how to play over all the things you are. So again, strongly recommending this book, and hope you enjoyed that. Let me know in the comments if there was any confusion. This was a really long video, so sorry about that, and I shall see you next time. Boom.